The big military plane touched down on the runway with a loud roar. Colonel James Mitchell looked out the small window and saw the gray skies of England for the first time. The weather was cold and cloudy, very different from the hot sun of Texas, where he lived. He had been flying for many hours and felt tired but also excited about his new mission. James was 50 years old and had been a soldier for 25 years. He was tall and strong with short gray hair and serious blue eyes. His uniform was covered with medals and badges that showed all the important things he had done in the army. He was proud of his work and always did his best to serve his country. The plane door opened and cold air rushed inside. James picked up his heavy bags and walked down the metal steps. His boots made a loud sound on the ground as he stepped onto British soil. This was a big moment for him. He had fought in many places around the world, but he had never been to England before. A young British soldier was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. The soldier stood very straight and saluted James with perfect form. "Welcome to England, sir," the soldier said in a polite voice with a strong British accent. "My name is Sergeant Williams. I am here to take you to your hotel." James saluted back and shook the sergeant's hand. "Thank you, Sergeant. I am glad to be here." He looked around at the military base. Everything was very clean and organized. The buildings were old but well kept. British flags flew in the wind, and soldiers walked around doing their jobs with quiet efficiency. Sergeant Williams helped James put his bags in a black car. As they drove away from the airport, James watched the countryside pass by. The fields were very green, and old stone walls divided the land into small sections. There were sheep eating grass and old churches with tall towers. Everything looked peaceful and beautiful. "This is my first time in England," James told the sergeant as they drove. "It is very different from America." "Yes, sir," Sergeant Williams replied. "England is a very old country. We have many traditions that go back hundreds of years. Some of our military customs are very old too." James nodded but did not think much about what the sergeant said. The American Army, traditions were important, but things could change when needed. James believed that good leadership and clear orders were the most important things. He thought that all armies around the world probably worked in similar ways. The car entered London, and James was amazed by what he saw. The buildings were much older than anything in America. Some looked like they were built hundreds of years ago. There were red buses, black taxis, and people walking everywhere. Big Ben stood tall in the distance, and the Thames River flowed through the city like a wide brown ribbon. "Look there, sir." Sergeant Williams pointed to a large building with tall gates. "That is Buckingham Palace, where the Queen lives." James looked at the palace and saw soldiers standing guard outside. Even from far away he could see they wore tall black hats and red uniforms. They stood perfectly still like statues. "Those are the Queen's guards?" he asked. "Yes, sir. They are the royal guards. They protect the palace and the royal family. It is a very important job." James watched the guards as the car drove past. He had heard about them before, but seeing them in person was different. They looked very serious and professional. In America, guards at important buildings were also serious, but these British guards seemed different somehow. They had a special quality that James could not quite understand. The car stopped at a nice hotel in the center of London. Sergeant Williams helped James with his bags and gave him some papers. "Your meetings start tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Sir," the sergeant explained. "A car will come to pick you up at 7:30. James thanked the sergeant and went into the hotel. His room was comfortable and had a good view of the city. He unpacked his clothes and hung up his uniforms. Then, he sat on the bed and read the papers the sergeant had given him. The papers explained his mission in England. He was part of a special program where American and British officers worked together to learn from each other. For the next month, James would visit different British military units and observe how they worked. He would also share American methods with British officers. One of the places he would visit was the Royal Guards Regiment. James was excited about this because the Royal Guards were famous around the world. He had seen them in movies and on television, but he would get to meet them in person and learn about their training. James read that the Royal Guards had been protecting British kings and queens for more than 300 years. They were some of the best soldiers in the British Army. Their uniforms, their training, and their ceremonies were all based on very old traditions. But James was not worried about traditions. He was confident in his ability to work with any group of soldiers. In his 25 years in the Army, he had worked with soldiers from many different countries. Good soldiers were good soldiers, no matter where they came from. And good officers knew how to lead any group of men. James looked out his hotel window at the busy London streets. People hurried along the sidewalks, cars moved through traffic, and life in the big city continued as it had for hundreds of years. Tomorrow, his real work would begin. He would start learning about the British military and sharing his own knowledge with them. He felt confident and ready for the challenge. James had always been successful in his military career because he was direct, honest, and clear in his leadership. He believed these qualities would serve him well in England, just as they had everywhere else he had served. As the sun began to set over London, James ate dinner and went to bed early. He wanted to be fresh and ready for his first day of meetings. He had no idea that his confidence and his American way of doing things would soon lead him into a situation that would surprise him more than anything in his long military career. The next morning would begin a journey that would teach James important lessons about respect, tradition, and the many different ways that soldiers around the world understand honor and duty. The alarm clock rang at 6 in the morning and James woke up quickly. He was used to getting up early and always started his day with exercise. He did push-ups and sit-ups in his hotel room, then took a hot shower and put on his dress uniform. Everything had to be perfect for his first day working with the British military. At exactly 7:30, a black car arrived at the hotel. The driver was a British corporal who saluted James and opened the car door for him. "Good morning, sir. I will take you to the Ministry of Defense for your first meeting." James got in the car and watched London wake up. People were walking to work, buses were full of passengers, and the city was starting its busy day. The car drove through streets with names like Piccadilly and Whitehall, names that James had heard in history books but was now seeing in real life. The Ministry of Defense building was huge and impressive. It was made of white stone and had many windows and tall columns. British flags flew from tall poles, and guards stood at the entrance. James could see that this was a place where important decisions were made. Inside the building, everything was very formal and traditional. The walls were covered with paintings of old battles and famous British generals. There were displays of old weapons and uniforms from wars that happened long ago. James noticed that everything was perfectly clean and organized, just like at the airport. A British major met James at the entrance. The major's name was Richard Thornton, and he was about 40 years old with a neat mustache and very polite manners. "Colonel Mitchell, welcome to London," Major Thornton said as he saluted. "I hope your flight was comfortable." "Yes, thank you, Major," James replied. "I am ready to start work." Major Thornton led James through long hallways to a conference room. Inside, several British officers were waiting around a large wooden table. They all stood up when James entered and saluted him with perfect timing. James saluted back and noticed how different their salute was from the American salute. It was more formal and seemed to have special meaning. "Gentlemen, this is Colonel Mitchell from the United States Army," Major Thornton announced. "He will be working with us for the next month as part of our exchange program." Each British officer introduced himself to James. They all spoke in polite, formal voices and shook hands with firm grips. James could tell they were professional soldiers, but they seemed more reserved than American officers. In America, officers often joked and talked casually with each other, but these British officers were more serious and formal. The meeting began with a presentation about British military history. James learned that the British Army was much older than the American Army. Some British regiments had been fighting for the country for more than 300 years. The officers talked about battles that happened before America was even founded as a country. "Our traditions are very important to us," explained Colonel Pemberton, an older officer with gray hair and many medals. "Every ceremony, every uniform, every custom has meaning. These traditions connect us to the brave soldiers who came before us." James listened politely, but he was thinking about how different this was from America. In the American Army, traditions were respected, but change was also welcome when it made things better. James believed that results were more important than old customs. If something worked better, it should be used, even if it was new. In America, we also respect our traditions, James said during the discussion. But we believe in adapting and improving when we can. Sometimes new ways of doing things are better than old ways. The British officers nodded politely, but James could see they did not completely agree with him. They seemed to believe that their old ways were the best ways and should not be changed. After the presentation, Major Thornton took James on a tour of the building. They visited different offices where officers planned military operations and training. Everyone they met was polite and professional. But James noticed something interesting. The British officers all seemed to follow very specific rules about how to behave. When they met a higher-ranking officer, the British officers saluted in a particular way and spoke with formal language. When they talked to each other, they used titles and formal addresses. Even when they were just walking down the hallway, they moved with careful, measured steps. "Your officers are very disciplined," James told Major Thornton as they walked. "Yes, sir," the major replied. "Discipline and proper conduct are very important in the British military. We believe that how a soldier behaves in small things shows how he will behave in big things." James understood discipline, but this seemed like more than that. It was as if every action had a deeper meaning that went beyond just following orders. In America, James was used to a more direct approach. Officers said what they meant, gave clear orders, and expected quick results. During lunch, James ate with several British officers in their dining room. The room was elegant, with white tablecloths, silver utensils, and paintings on the walls. Even eating lunch seemed to be a formal ceremony. The officers used proper table manners and spoke quietly about military matters. "Tomorrow you will begin visiting our different units," Major Thornton told James. "Your first visit will be to see the Coldstream Guards Regiment." "Are those the guards who protect the Queen?" James asked. "Yes, sir. They are one of the regiments that make up the Royal Guards. They have been protecting the monarch for over 300 years. It is a great honor to serve in the Royal Guards." James was interested to learn more. "What makes them special compared to other soldiers?" The British officers looked at each other before answering. "The Royal Guards are not just soldiers, sir," explained Captain Davies, a young officer. "They are guardians of our history and our nation's honor. Their duty goes beyond normal military service. They must follow very strict protocols," added Major Thornton. "Every movement, every gesture, every response is governed by centuries of tradition. They cannot deviate from these protocols under any circumstances." James nodded, but he was not sure he understood completely. In America, guards at important buildings also followed strict rules, but they could adapt when necessary. Good soldiers knew when to follow rules exactly and when to use their judgment. After lunch, James spent the afternoon in meetings where he learned about British military training and organization. He shared information about American methods and answered questions about how the U.S. Army worked. The British officers were polite and interested, but James could tell they were not eager to change their own methods. As the day ended, James felt that he had learned a lot, but he also felt a bit frustrated. The British military seemed to be very focused on form and ceremony, while James was more interested in practical results. He respected their history and traditions, but he wondered if all these formal customs might slow down decision-making and action. That evening, James returned to his hotel and thought about his first day. The British officers were clearly professional and dedicated, but their approach to military service was very different from what he was used to. He wondered how this difference would affect his work with them over the next month. James looked out his hotel window at the lights of London. Tomorrow, he would visit the famous Royal Guards and see for himself what made them so special. He was confident that his experience and leadership skills would help him understand and work effectively with any group of soldiers, no matter how traditional they might be. He had no idea that his meeting with the Royal Guards would challenge everything he thought he knew about military protocol and teach him lessons he would remember for the rest of his life. James woke up early on his second day in London feeling excited about visiting the Royal Guards. After his morning exercise and breakfast, he put on his best uniform and made sure every button and medal was perfectly placed. He wanted to make a good impression on the famous soldiers he was about to meet. Major Thornton arrived at the hotel in a military car at 8 o'clock sharp. "Good morning, Colonel Mitchell," he said, as James got into the car. "Today will be very interesting for you. The Coldstream Guards are expecting us at Wellington Barracks." As they drove through London, Major Thornton began explaining more about the Royal Guards. "The guards you will meet today are not ordinary soldiers, sir," he said in a serious voice. "They are chosen from the best soldiers in the British Army. Only men with perfect records and special skills can join the Royal Guards." James listened carefully as they drove past busy streets and old buildings. "What kind of special skills do they need?" he asked. "They must be excellent soldiers first," Major Thornton explained. "But they also need perfect discipline, the ability to stand motionless for hours, and complete dedication to their duty. Most importantly, they must understand and follow hundreds of years of protocol without question." The car turned into a street lined with impressive military buildings. James could see soldiers walking around in different uniforms, some carrying rifles and others doing various military duties. Everything looked very organized and professional. "Wellington Barracks is one of the most important military bases in London," Major Thornton continued. "This is where the Royal Guards live and train when they are not on duty at the palace. The barracks has been here for almost 200 years. As they drove through the gates of Wellington Barracks, James was impressed by what he saw. The buildings were made of red brick and looked both strong and elegant. British flags flew from several poles, and guards stood at attention at important entrances. Everything was spotlessly clean, and even the grass seemed to be cut to exactly the right length. They stopped in front of a large building with white columns and many windows. A group of officers was waiting for them at the entrance. All of them wore perfect uniforms and stood with excellent posture. When James got out of the car, they all saluted at exactly the same moment with perfect precision. "Colonel Mitchell, welcome to Wellington Barracks," said a tall officer with gray hair and many medals on his chest. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion Coldstream Guards." James saluted back and shook hands with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. The British officer had a firm handshake and looked directly into James's eyes with confidence and respect. James could tell immediately that this was a serious, professional soldier. "It is an honor to meet you, sir," James replied. "I have heard many good things about the Royal Guards." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison smiled slightly. "We are proud of our regiment and our traditions, Colonel. Today, you will learn about our history, our training, and our duties. I think you will find it very interesting." The group of officers walked into the building, and James was amazed by what he saw inside. The walls were covered with paintings of battles, portraits of kings and queens, and displays of old uniforms and weapons. Everything told the story of centuries of service to the British Crown. In a large room with wooden panels and comfortable chairs, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison began explaining the history of the Royal Guards. "The Coldstream Guards was formed in 1650, he said, pointing to old paintings on the wall. "We have served the Crown for over 370 years. We have fought in every major war and have always been ready to defend our country." James was impressed by the long history, but he was more interested in learning about current operations. "What are your main duties today?" he asked. "We have two main responsibilities," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison explained. "First, we are infantry, soldiers who can be sent anywhere in the world to fight for Britain. Second, we provide ceremonial guards for the royal family and important state occasions." Captain Morrison, a younger officer, took over the presentation. "The ceremonial duties are very demanding," he said. "Our guards must stand perfectly still for hours at a time, regardless of weather or distractions. They cannot move, speak, or react to anything around them unless it is a real threat." "How do they train for that?" James asked. He had never heard of soldiers who had to stand completely still for so long. "The training is very intense," Captain Morrison replied. "New guards spend months learning to control their bodies and minds. They practice standing still for longer and longer periods. They learn to ignore heat, cold, rain, and even people who try to make them move or laugh. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison added, "The guards must also memorize hundreds of protocols and procedures. They must know exactly how to respond to every possible situation while on duty. There can be no mistakes when protecting the royal family." James was beginning to understand that being a royal guard was much more complicated than he had thought. In America, guards at important places were well trained, but this seemed to require a completely different level of dedication and skill. "Would you like to see our training facilities?" Lieutenant Colonel Harrison asked. "Yes, very much," James replied. They walked through several rooms where guards practiced their duties. In one room, soldiers stood perfectly still while instructors watched them carefully, checking their posture and looking for any sign of movement. In another room, guards practiced marching with the precise, slow steps that were used in ceremonies. James watched as young soldiers learned to put on the famous tall black hats that royal guards wore. The hats were much heavier than they looked, and wearing them required special training. The soldiers also practiced with the traditional red uniforms and white gloves that made the royal guards famous around the world. "Everything must be perfect," explained Sergeant Major Williams, an older soldier with many years of experience. "A guard's uniform, his posture, his movements, his weapon. Everything must be exactly right. Even the smallest mistake is not acceptable." In the weapons room, James saw the traditional rifles that royal guards carried. They were not ordinary military weapons, but special ceremonial rifles that were perfectly maintained and polished. Each rifle was treated with great care and respect. "The guards' rifles are not just for show," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison explained. "Every royal guard is a trained soldier who can use his weapon if necessary. The ceremonial duties do not make them any less capable as fighters." During lunch in the officers' dining room, James ate with several Royal Guards officers. They told him stories about their experiences protecting the royal family and participating in important ceremonies. James was impressed by their dedication and professionalism, but he also noticed something else. The officers spoke about their duties with a kind of reverence that James had never heard before. For them, being a royal guard was not just a job, or even an honor. It was a sacred responsibility that connected them to centuries of history and tradition. "When we put on the uniform and stand guard," said Captain Davies, "we are not just individual soldiers. We represent every guard who has served before us and every guard who will serve after us. We are part of something much bigger than ourselves." After lunch, James was told that he would have the opportunity to inspect an actual guard unit the next day. This would be his chance to see the Royal Guards performing their real duties, not just training. "Tomorrow morning you will visit the guard post at St. James's Palace," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison told him. "You will be able to observe the guards on duty and see how they perform their responsibilities." James was excited about this opportunity. He had been studying the Royal Guards for only one day, but he was already impressed by their training and dedication. Tomorrow, he would see them in action and get a better understanding of what made them so special. As he rode back to his hotel, that evening James thought about everything he had learned. The Royal Guards were clearly exceptional soldiers, but their approach to military service was very different from anything he had experienced in America. Their focus on tradition, ceremony, and unchanging protocol was both impressive and puzzling to him. James was confident that his visit tomorrow would help him understand the Royal Guards better. He looked forward to meeting them and observing their work firsthand. He had no idea that his American approach to military leadership was about to clash with centuries of British tradition in a way that would shock everyone involved. The morning sun was shining brightly when James left his hotel for what would become the most memorable day of his military career. He had spent the previous evening reading more about Royal Guards protocols, feeling confident that his experience with military inspections would serve him well. His uniform was perfect, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his confidence was high. Major Thornton picked him up at 8 o'clock, and they drove through the busy London streets towards St. James's Palace. The traffic was heavy with morning commuters, but James barely noticed. His mind was focused on the upcoming inspection and the opportunity to see the famous Royal Guards in action. Today will be different from yesterday. Major Thornton explained as they drove. Yesterday you learned about the guards in training. Today you will see them performing their actual duties. They will be in full ceremonial dress and following active protocols. James nodded confidently. I understand. I have conducted many military inspections before. I know how to evaluate soldiers and their performance. Major Thornton glanced at James with a slight expression of concern. Sir, if I may suggest, the Royal Guards operate under very specific protocols. It might be helpful to observe first, before— Major, I appreciate your concern, James interrupted politely but firmly. But I have been inspecting soldiers for 25 years. Good soldiers are good soldiers, regardless of their nationality or specific duties. They arrived at St. James's Palace, one of the oldest royal palaces in London. The building was made of red brick and looked like something from a fairy tale, with tall chimneys and many windows. British flags flew from the roof, and everything about the place spoke of centuries of history and royal tradition. At the entrance to the palace grounds, James saw them for the first time in their full glory. 2 royal guards stood at attention on either side of the gate, wearing the famous red tunics with gold buttons, white belts that crossed their chests, and the tall black bearskin hats that made them look even taller than they actually were. James was immediately struck by their appearance. They stood perfectly still, looking straight ahead with no expression on their faces. Their uniforms were absolutely perfect, with every button polished and every piece of equipment in exactly the right place. They held their rifles in the traditional position and seemed like statues rather than living men. Magnificent, James said quietly to Major Thornton. They look exactly like the pictures I have seen. Yes, sir. These guards have been on duty since 6 this morning and will remain until 2 this afternoon. They will not move unless there is a direct threat, or unless they are properly relieved by other guards. A group of British officers met James at the palace entrance. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was there, along with Captain Morrison and several other officers from the Coldstream Guards Regiment. They all saluted James and welcomed him warmly. Colonel Mitchell, we are honored to have you observe our guards today, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said. Please feel free to ask any questions about what you see. James thanked the officers and began his observation. He walked around the guards, noting their posture, their equipment, and their bearing. Everything was indeed perfect. Their rifles were spotless, their uniforms were immaculate, and their discipline was impressive. As James observed, crowds of tourists began to gather. People from all over the world came to see the famous royal guards, taking pictures and trying to get the guards to move or react. Children made funny faces at the guards, adults told jokes loudly, and some people even waved their hands in front of the guards' faces, but the guards never moved. They continued to stare straight ahead, completely ignoring everything around them. James was impressed by their self-control and discipline. In America, guards at important buildings were also trained to ignore distractions, but he had never seen anything quite like this level of complete stillness. How do they maintain such perfect discipline? James asked Captain Morrison. Years of training, sir, the captain replied. They learn to focus their minds completely on their duty. Nothing else exists for them while they are on guard. James spent an hour watching the guards and asking questions about their training and procedures. He learned that the guards change positions every few hours to prevent fatigue, but while on duty they were expected to be absolutely motionless and alert. Would it be possible for me to inspect the guards more closely? James asked Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. In the American Army, we have standard inspection procedures that help evaluate soldiers' readiness and attention to detail. The British officers looked at each other with expressions that James could not quite interpret. There seemed to be some unspoken communication between them. Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said carefully, the Royal Guards follow very specific protocols when on active duty. Perhaps it would be better to arrange for you to inspect guards who are off duty in a training situation. But James was feeling confident and eager to demonstrate his leadership skills. Lieutenant Colonel, I understand your concern for protocol, but a proper military inspection is standard procedure in any professional army. I would like to inspect these guards to evaluate their readiness and bearing. Major Thornton stepped forward. Colonel Mitchell, perhaps we should discuss the specific protocols involved before. Major, James said with authority, I appreciate everyone's concern, but I am an experienced officer conducting a routine military inspection. I know how to do this properly. The British officers exchanged more glances, but they could not refuse a direct request from a visiting American colonel. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison nodded reluctantly. Very well, sir. Please proceed. James approached the guards with the confidence that had served him well throughout his career. In America, when a senior officer approached guards for inspection, it was normal for them to acknowledge the officer and respond to commands. James expected the same professional behavior from these British soldiers. He stopped directly in front of the first guard, a young man who stood about 6 feet tall in his impressive uniform. The guard stared straight ahead, showing no sign that he had noticed James's approach. James studied the guard's equipment, noting the perfect condition of his rifle and the precise arrangement of his uniform. Excellent presentation, soldier, James said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The guard did not respond or acknowledge the compliment in any way. James moved to the second guard and conducted a similar observation. This guard was also perfectly turned out, with every detail of his uniform and equipment meeting the highest standards. James was genuinely impressed by what he saw. Feeling confident and wanting to complete a proper military inspection, James stepped back and positioned himself where both guards could see him clearly. He drew himself up to his full height and spoke in his commanding officer voice, the same voice that had been obeyed by thousands of American soldiers over the years. Guards, James called out in a clear, authoritative tone that carried across the palace courtyard. Attention for inspection. What happened next would be burned into James's memory forever. He expected the guards to acknowledge his command, to shift slightly into an inspection-ready position, or at least to show some sign that they had heard him. Instead, something completely unexpected occurred. Both guards remained absolutely motionless. Not a muscle moved. They continued to stare straight ahead as if James had not spoken at all. The silence that followed was deafening, and James felt a cold shock of confusion run through his body. James tried again, speaking even more clearly and with greater authority. Guards, present arms for inspection. Again, nothing happened. The guards stood like statues, completely unresponsive to his commands. James felt his face beginning to flush with embarrassment and confusion. In 25 years of military service, no soldier had ever failed to respond to his direct commands. The British officers stood frozen, watching the scene with expressions of deep concern and embarrassment. The tourists continued to take pictures, unaware that they were witnessing a moment that would change James's understanding of military tradition forever. James realized that something was very wrong, but he had no idea what it was or how to fix. The shocking response or lack of response from the Royal Guards had just taught him that there were aspects of military service that he did not understand at all. The seconds felt like hours as James stood in front of the two Royal Guards, waiting for some kind of response to his commands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard, and the normal sounds of London traffic seemed to fade into the background. All James could hear was his own heartbeat and the quiet shuffling of tourists' feet on the cobblestones. James had given clear, direct orders to the guards, just as he had done thousands of times before with American soldiers. But these British guards stood like marble statues, completely unmoved by his authority. Their eyes stared straight ahead, their rifles remained in the exact same position, and their faces showed no expression at all. The confusion on James's face was obvious to everyone watching. His confident posture began to sag slightly as he realized that something was seriously wrong. In his entire military career, no soldier had ever ignored his direct commands. This was not just unexpected. It was shocking. Major Thornton stepped forward, his face pale with concern. He could see that the situation was becoming very uncomfortable for everyone involved. "Colonel Mitchell," he said quietly, "perhaps we should—" But James was not ready to give up. His pride and his years of military training told him that there must be some explanation for what was happening. Maybe the guards had not heard him clearly. Maybe they were following some procedure he did not understand. He decided to try one more time, speaking even more loudly and with greater authority. "Royal Guards," James called out, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "I am Colonel James Mitchell of the United States Army. You will acknowledge my presence and prepare for inspection." The result was exactly the same as before. The guards did not move even slightly. They did not blink. They did not shift their weight. They did not turn their heads. It was as if James was invisible, as if his words had no meaning at all. A small crowd of tourists had stopped to watch what was happening. Some of them were taking pictures and videos, thinking this was part of some kind of ceremony. Others looked confused, sensing that something unusual was taking place but not understanding what it was. James felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the cool London morning. His hands were shaking slightly and his face was turning, red with embarrassment and frustration. He had never felt so powerless and confused in his life. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison moved closer to James, his expression showing both sympathy and deep concern. "Colonel Mitchell," he said in a low voice, "I think we need to step away and discuss this situation." But James was too shocked and confused to move. He stared at the guards, trying to understand what was happening. These were soldiers, just like the men he had commanded for 25 years. They wore uniforms, they carried weapons, they had been trained to follow orders. Why were they ignoring him? "Sir," Captain Morrison said softly, "please allow us to explain the situation to you." James finally turned away from the guards and looked at the British officers. He could see concern and embarrassment in their faces, but also something else, a kind of understanding that he did not share. "What is wrong with them?" James asked, his voice showing his confusion and frustration. "Why are they not responding to my commands? Are they deaf? Are they sick? Have I done something wrong?" The British officers looked at each other, and James could see they were trying to decide how to explain something that was clearly very complicated. Major Thornton was the first to speak. "Sir, the Royal Guards are following their protocols exactly as they have been trained to do," he said carefully. "They are not ignoring you out of disrespect or disobedience." "Then why won't they acknowledge my commands?" James demanded. "I am a colonel in the United States Army. I outrank most of the officers here. Why won't they respond to my authority?" Lieutenant Colonel Harrison took a deep breath before answering. "Colonel Mitchell, the Royal Guards have very specific rules about who they can and cannot acknowledge while on duty. These rules have been in place for centuries and they cannot be changed or ignored for any reason." James was becoming more frustrated and confused. "What kind of rules? What do you mean they cannot acknowledge me? I am a military officer conducting a legitimate inspection." "Sir," Captain Morrison said gently, "the Royal Guards are sworn to protect the crown and to follow the protocols established by the royal household. They can only respond to commands from specific people in their direct chain of command and from members of the royal family." The words hit James like a physical blow. He stared at the British officers, trying to process what they had just told him. "Are you saying that they will not obey orders from me because I am not British?" he asked. "It is not about nationality, sir," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison explained. "The guards will not respond to commands from any officer who is not in their specific chain of command. Regardless of rank or nationality, they could not respond to commands from a British general if that general was not authorized to command the Royal Guards." James felt the blood draining from his face as he began to understand the full meaning of what had happened. The guards had not ignored him out of disrespect or rebellion. They had ignored him because their duty required them to ignore him. "But I am a colonel," James said weakly. "I have commanded thousands of soldiers. I have the authority to inspect any military unit." "Not this unit, sir," Major Thornton said with genuine sympathy in his voice. "The Royal Guards answer only to the Crown and to their designated commanders. No one else has the authority to command them, regardless of their rank or position." James looked back at the guards who continued to stand in perfect stillness. He began to realize that what he had interpreted as disrespect was actually the highest form of military discipline he had ever witnessed. These guards were so dedicated to their duty that they would ignore a foreign colonel rather than break their oath to the crown. The tourists around them had begun to realize that something unusual was happening. Some of them were whispering to each other and pointing at James and the British officers. A few were still taking pictures, but most seemed to sense that they were witnessing something serious and uncomfortable. "I had no idea," James said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I thought I was conducting a routine military inspection. I never meant to." "We know, sir," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said kindly. "You could not have known about our protocols. This is not your fault." But James felt humiliated and embarrassed. He had tried to exercise authority that he did not possess, and he had done it in front of tourists and British officers. His confident approach had led to a shocking demonstration of his own ignorance about British military traditions. "I need to understand this better," James said, looking at the British officers with new respect and humility. "Can you explain to me exactly how this works? Who can command the Royal Guards? What are the rules they follow?" The British officers nodded, clearly relieved that James was willing to learn rather than continuing to be frustrated or angry. "Of course, sir," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said. "But perhaps we should move to a more private location where we can discuss this properly." As they walked away from the guard post, James took one last look at the two guards who had just taught him such an important lesson. They remained in their positions, staring straight ahead, completely focused on their duty. They had not moved, even slightly during the entire incident. James realized that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. These guards had shown a level of dedication and discipline that went far beyond anything he had ever seen. Their shocking response to his commands had revealed a depth of military honor that he was only beginning to understand. The British officers led James to a quiet room inside St. James's Palace, away from the tourists and the embarrassing scene at the guard post. The room was elegant and formal, with old portraits on the walls and comfortable leather chairs around, a polished wooden table. James sat down heavily, still trying to process what had just happened to him. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison poured tea for everyone, a gesture that seemed both calming and very British. James accepted the cup gratefully, though his hands were still shaking slightly from the shock of his experience with the guards. "Colonel Mitchell," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison began gently, "what you witnessed today is the result of protocols that have been in place for over 300 years. These rules are not meant to insult or exclude anyone. They exist to protect the crown and to maintain the sacred trust between the royal guards and the royal family." James looked up from his tea, his face still showing confusion and embarrassment. "I still don't completely understand," he said. "Can you explain to me exactly who has the authority to command the royal guards?" Major Thornton pulled out a folder with official documents and opened it on the table. "These are the protocols that govern the royal guards," he explained. "They are very specific and cannot be changed without direct authorization from the royal household." Captain Morrison pointed to a list in the documents. "The royal guards can only acknowledge commands from these people: members of the royal family, the commanding officer of their specific regiment, certain designated senior officers in their chain of command, and the monarch's official representatives in specific situations." "No one else?" James asked. "No one else, Lieutenant Colonel," Harrison confirmed. "Not the Prime Minister, not foreign heads of state, not generals from other branches of the military, and not visiting officers from other countries, regardless of their rank or importance." James stared at the documents, beginning to understand the full scope of what he had encountered. "So when I gave them commands, they were actually required to ignore me?" "Yes, sir," Major Thornton said. "If they had responded to your commands, they would have been violating their oath and breaking protocols that have been sacred for centuries. They would have faced serious punishment, possibly including dismissal from the royal guards." The revelation hit James like a physical blow. He had been upset and confused when the guards ignored him, but now he realized that they had actually been showing him the highest respect by maintaining their discipline and following their duty. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," James said slowly. "Those guards were not being disrespectful to me. They were being respectful to their oath and to the crown?" "Exactly," Captain Morrison replied. In their minds, there was no choice to make. Their duty to the Crown is absolute and cannot be compromised for any reason. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison leaned forward in his chair. Colonel Mitchell, you must understand that the Royal Guards are not ordinary soldiers. They are living symbols of the British monarchy and the continuity of our nation. Their loyalty cannot be divided or shared. James was beginning to see the situation in a completely different light. So when I tried to inspect them, I was essentially asking them to betray their most sacred duty. In a sense, yes, Major Thornton said sympathetically. Though you had no way of knowing that at the time. James put his head in his hands, feeling the full weight of his mistake. I feel terrible about this. I never intended to put those soldiers in such a difficult position. They were not in a difficult position, sir, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison assured him. For them, there was no difficulty at all. Their training and their oath made their response automatic. They knew exactly what they had to do. Captain Morrison opened another document. Perhaps this will help you understand better, he said. This is the oath that every Royal Guard takes when he joins the regiment. James read the oath carefully. It was written in formal, traditional language, but its meaning was clear. The Guards swore complete loyalty to the Crown, promised to protect the royal family with their lives, and vowed to follow the ancient protocols without question or hesitation. This is more than a military oath, James said after reading it. This is almost like a religious vow. In many ways it is, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison agreed. The Royal Guards see their service as a sacred duty, not just a job. They are guardians of something much larger than themselves. Major Thornton pointed to another section of the documents. The protocols also specify exactly how the Guards must behave in different situations. When faced with unauthorized commands, they must ignore them completely, as if they had not been given at all. So they were trained to do exactly what they did to me? James asked. Yes, sir. They responded exactly as they were supposed to respond. Their training worked perfectly. James was quiet for several minutes, absorbing everything he had learned. Finally, he looked up at the British officers with a new expression of respect and understanding. I owe those Guards an apology, he said. No, sir, you do not, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said firmly. You were conducting yourself as any professional officer would in your situation. The Guards understand that you were not familiar with our protocols. They do not feel offended or disrespected. But I feel like I challenged their honor, James said. You tested their honor, Captain Morrison corrected gently. And they passed the test perfectly. In a way, you helped demonstrate the strength of their discipline and their commitment to their duty. Major Thornton added, If anything, sir, what happened today should make you proud of the Guards' performance. They showed that no external pressure, no matter how authoritative, can make them abandon their principles. James was beginning to see the incident from a completely different perspective. Instead of viewing the Guards' response as shocking disobedience, he was starting to understand it as an extraordinary display of integrity and dedication. In America, we have Guards at important places too, James said thoughtfully. But I have never seen anything like this level of absolute commitment to protocol. Different countries have different traditions, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said diplomatically. But few have traditions as old and as strictly maintained as those of the Royal Guards. How do they train soldiers to have this kind of discipline? James asked. How do you teach someone to ignore a direct order from a superior officer? It takes years of training, Captain Morrison explained. The Guards learn not just to follow orders, but to understand which orders they can follow and which orders they must ignore. They develop the ability to distinguish between legitimate authority and unauthorized commands. It must be very difficult training, James said. It is extremely difficult, Major Thornton confirmed. Many excellent soldiers try to become Royal Guards but fail because they cannot develop this level of specialized discipline. James stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace courtyard where the Guards continued their silent vigil. Those men out there, he said quietly. They represent something that I never fully understood before today. What is that, sir? Lieutenant Colonel Harrison asked. They represent the idea that some duties are so important, so sacred, that they cannot be compromised under any circumstances, James replied. even when it might seem rude or disobedient to outsiders. The British officers smiled, pleased that James was beginning to understand the deeper meaning of what he had witnessed. "Colonel Mitchell," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said, "what you learned today is something that many people never understand, even after years of contact with the Royal Guards. You have gained insight into one of the oldest and most honored traditions in the British military." James turned back to the group, his face showing a mixture of humility and newfound respect. "I came here thinking I would teach these guards something about military leadership," he said. "Instead, they taught me something much more important about military honor." As the afternoon sun began to shine through the windows of the palace room, James felt a profound change taking place in his understanding of military service. The embarrassment and confusion he had felt earlier were being replaced by something much deeper, a genuine respect for principles that he had never encountered before. "I would like to go back and observe the guards again," James told the British officers. "But this time I want to watch them with proper understanding of what they represent." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison smiled. "Of course, Colonel Mitchell. I think you will see them quite differently now." The group walked back through the palace corridors toward the guard post. James noticed things he had missed before: the portraits of past monarchs watching over the halls, the careful maintenance of centuries-old traditions, and the quiet dignity that seemed to fill every corner of the building. When they reached the courtyard, James approached the guards again, but this time his attitude was completely different. Instead of seeing soldiers who had disobeyed him, he saw men who had demonstrated the highest form of military integrity he had ever witnessed. The same two guards were still at their posts, standing in exactly the same positions as before. They had not moved during the entire time James had been in the meeting room. Their faces showed no signs of fatigue, distraction, or concern about the earlier incident. "How long have they been standing there?" James asked quietly. "They began their duty at 6 this morning," Captain Morrison replied. "They will remain until 2 this afternoon, when the next guards will relieve them." James calculated quickly. "That's 8 hours of standing perfectly still?" "Yes, sir, and they do this in all kinds of weather: rain, snow, heat, and cold. Nothing breaks their concentration or their discipline." James watched the guards with new eyes. He began to see not just their perfect uniforms and rigid posture, but the incredible mental strength required to maintain such discipline for so many hours. He thought about his own experiences as a soldier and realized that he had never been asked to demonstrate this level of self-control. A group of tourists approached the guards, and James watched carefully to see how they would respond. The tourists tried many different ways to get the guards' attention, making jokes, asking questions, waving their hands, and even making silly faces. The guards ignored all of it completely, as if the tourists did not exist. "This is remarkable," James said to Major Thornton. "They have trained their minds to focus so completely on their duty that they can ignore any distraction." "It is more than training," Major Thornton replied. "It is a complete commitment to something larger than themselves. They understand that they are not just individual soldiers, but living representations of British history and tradition." James noticed something else about the guards that he had missed before. Despite their rigid stillness, they were clearly alert and aware of everything around them. Their eyes moved slightly to track potential threats, and their grip on their rifles showed they were ready to act if necessary. "They're not just standing still," James observed. "They're actively guarding. They're watching for any real danger, while ignoring everything that isn't a threat." "Exactly," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said with approval. "They have learned to distinguish between what requires their attention and what they must ignore. It's a very sophisticated form of discipline." As James continued to watch, he began to understand that the guards' training went far beyond physical endurance. They had developed the mental ability to maintain 2 different states of awareness at the same time: complete stillness and alertness for their ceremonial duties, combined with constant readiness to respond to genuine security threats. "In America, our guards are trained to be alert and ready," James said thoughtfully. "But this is something different. This is training the mind to operate at multiple levels simultaneously." Captain Morrison nodded. "The Royal Guards must be ceremonial performers and professional soldiers at the same time. It requires a unique kind of mental discipline that takes years to develop. James spent the next hour watching different aspects of the Guards' performance. He observed how they dealt with changing weather conditions, how they responded to loud noises, and how they maintained their focus despite constant streams of tourists. During this time, several important-looking people approached the Guards. James noticed that the Guards responded differently to some of these visitors. When certain individuals approached, the Guards would make small adjustments to their posture or position, showing that they recognized authorized persons even while maintaining their ceremonial stillness. They know who has legitimate authority, James observed. They can recognize authorized personnel without breaking their ceremonial posture. Yes, Major Thornton confirmed. They are trained to identify people who have the right to approach them or give them commands. It's another layer of their specialized training. As the afternoon progressed, James watched the ceremony of changing the guard. New guards marched into position with perfect precision, while the guards who had been on duty since morning were formally relieved. The entire process was conducted with elaborate ceremony, but James now understood that it was more than just tradition. It was a carefully designed system for maintaining continuous security while honoring centuries of protocol. During the changing ceremony, James noticed that every movement was performed with perfect timing and coordination. The guards who were being relieved maintained their positions until the exact moment they were officially replaced. There was never a single second when the post was unguarded or when protocol was relaxed. Even the change of guard follows the same principles, James said with growing admiration. Duty first, protocol always, no compromise under any circumstances. That's exactly right, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said. Every aspect of their service is governed by the same unbreakable commitment to their oath and their duty. After watching the changing ceremony, James asked to speak with one of the guards who had just been relieved. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arranged for James to meet with Guardsman Thompson, a young soldier who had been serving with the Royal Guards for 2 years. Guardsman Thompson, James said when they were introduced, I want to apologize for my behavior earlier today. I did not understand your protocols and I put you in an impossible situation. Guardsman Thompson stood at attention and replied in a clear, respectful voice. Sir, no apology is necessary. You were acting as any officer would in your position. We understood that you were not familiar with our specific duties. Were you offended when I tried to give you commands? James asked. No, sir, Guardsman Thompson replied. Our training teaches us to distinguish between authorized and unauthorized commands. When we receive unauthorized commands, we simply do not process them as orders. It's not a matter of being offended. It's a matter of following our training. James was impressed by the young soldier's maturity and clarity of thought. How did you develop the mental discipline to ignore a direct order from a superior officer? Sir, our training teaches us that our highest loyalty is to the Crown and our oath, Guardsman Thompson explained. When that loyalty conflicts with other demands, the choice is always clear. There is no internal struggle because our priorities are absolute. That's an extraordinary level of commitment, James said with genuine admiration. Thank you, sir. We are proud to serve in this way. As James shook hands with Guardsman Thompson, he realized that his entire understanding of military discipline had been transformed. He had always believed that good soldiers followed orders from superior officers. Now he understood that the highest form of military discipline might sometimes require soldiers to refuse orders that conflict with their most sacred duties. Walking back through London that evening, James reflected on everything he had learned. The shocking response of the Royal Guards had initially made him feel frustrated and embarrassed. Now he understood that their response had been the most professional and honorable behavior he had ever witnessed from any soldiers in his entire career. 6 months after his return to the United States, Colonel James Mitchell stood before a group of senior American officers at the Pentagon, preparing to give a presentation about his experiences in England. The conference room was filled with colonels, generals, and other high-ranking military personnel who had gathered to hear about the international exchange program. James had given many military briefings before, but this one was different. Today he would share a story that had fundamentally changed his understanding of military honor and duty. The PowerPoint slides behind him showed pictures of the Royal Guards, but he knew that no photograph could capture the real meaning of what he had witnessed. "Gentlemen," James began, "I want to tell you about the most important military lesson I learned in my 25 years of service. It came from soldiers who refused to obey my direct orders." The room fell silent. Every officer present understood the serious implications of soldiers refusing to follow orders. James could see curiosity and concern on their faces as they waited for him to explain. James told the complete story of his encounter with the Royal Guards, from his confident arrival in London to the shocking moment when the guards ignored his commands. He described his initial confusion and embarrassment, and then his gradual understanding of the principles that governed the guards' behavior. "These guards taught me that there are levels of military honor that go beyond following orders," James explained. "They showed me that the highest form of military integrity sometimes requires soldiers to refuse commands that conflict with their most sacred duties." General Patterson, a veteran officer with 30 years of experience, raised his hand. "Colonel Mitchell, are you suggesting that soldiers should be trained to disobey orders from superior officers?" "No, sir," James replied carefully. "I'm suggesting that we need to understand the difference between absolute loyalty and blind obedience. The Royal Guards demonstrated absolute loyalty to their oath and their mission, even when that meant appearing to be disobedient to someone who didn't understand their protocols." Colonel Williams, who had served in several international assignments, asked, "How do we apply this lesson to American military training? Our system is based on clear chains of command and immediate obedience to orders." James had anticipated this question. "Sir, I believe we can learn from the Royal Guards without changing our basic command structure. The lesson is about the importance of understanding why soldiers follow orders, not just training them to follow orders automatically." James clicked to the next slide, which showed a picture of the guards standing at their posts. These soldiers had such a clear understanding of their mission and their values that they could make correct decisions even in unexpected situations. They didn't need to ask for permission or wait for clarification. Their training had given them the wisdom to know what they should and should not do. Over the following months, James began incorporating lessons from his London experience into his own training programs. He found ways to help American soldiers understand the deeper meaning of their service and the importance of maintaining integrity, even under pressure. James started teaching young officers about the concept of principled disobedience, the idea that sometimes maintaining honor requires refusing to compromise on fundamental values. He used the example of the Royal Guards to show how clear principles could guide decision-making in complex situations. "The guards in London taught me that true military discipline is not about blindly following any order from any person in uniform," James would tell his trainees. "True discipline is about understanding your mission so clearly that you can make the right choice even when faced with conflicting demands." James also began sharing the story with other American officers who were assigned to international exchanges. He wanted them to understand that different military traditions had different ways of expressing honor and loyalty, and that these differences should be respected rather than challenged. The story of his encounter with the Royal Guards became well known throughout the American military. Other officers began inviting James to speak at conferences and training sessions, where he would share the lessons he had learned about tradition, honor, and the complexity of military service in different cultures. 1 year after his return from London, James received a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, his British counterpart. The letter informed him that Guardsman Thompson, the young soldier James had spoken with after the incident, had been promoted and had received a commendation for his exemplary service. "Colonel Mitchell," the letter read, "I thought you would be pleased to know that Guardsman Thompson often speaks about his conversation with you. He says that meeting an American officer who took the time to understand our traditions, rather than simply criticizing them, reinforced his pride in serving as a Royal Guard." James was deeply moved by the letter. He realized that his experience in London had been meaningful not just for him, but also for the British soldiers who had witnessed his transformation from confusion to understanding. As his military career continued, James found himself thinking often about the Royal Guards and the lessons they had taught him. When faced with difficult decisions or complex situations, he would remember their unwavering commitment to their principles and their ability to maintain integrity under pressure. The incident that had initially seemed like a professional embarrassment had become the foundation for a deeper understanding of military service. James learned to appreciate the wisdom that comes from centuries of tradition, while also maintaining his belief in the importance of adaptation and improvement. In his final years of military service, James became known as an officer who understood both the importance of innovation and the value of tradition. He taught younger officers to respect the military customs of other nations while remaining proud of their own heritage. When James retired from the Army, he was awarded several medals for his contributions to international military cooperation. But he always said that his most important achievement was learning to see military honor through the eyes of two young British soldiers who had been willing to risk an international incident rather than compromise their oath to the crown. Years later, whenever people asked James about the most important moment of his military career, he would tell them about the day he tried to order Royal Guards to salute, and how their shocking response taught him that true military honor sometimes means standing firm when everyone expects you to bend. "Those guards," James would say with deep respect in his voice, "showed me what it really means to be a soldier. They taught me that the highest duty is not to follow orders, but to follow principles. And they demonstrated that the strongest military discipline comes not from fear of punishment, but from love of honor." The story of Colonel Mitchell and the Royal Guards became a teaching tool used in military academies and leadership courses around the world. It illustrated the importance of understanding different military cultures, the complexity of honor and duty, and the unexpected wisdom that can come from moments of professional humility. James's encounter with the Royal Guards had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact influenced the rest of his life and the lives of countless other military personnel who heard his story. The Guards' shocking response had revealed truths about military service that James would carry with him forever and would continue to share with others long after his retirement from active duty.